What's up, Wizards? It's Dev. Thanks for joining us because it's the big one. It's the Murders at Karlov Manor Top 50, and I really don't want to waste any of your time, so let's go ahead and roll the jam, and I'll see you on the other side.
And I'm your favorite magic channel's favorite magic channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we are back. But even though there's a murder afoot, I'm a YouTuber. I've always got time for a good old call to action. So make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoy what you see around here. And who are we kidding? Of course you do. Now let's also take a second, by the way, just to thank this video's sponsor. Not a company or anything like that. Just a dude named Michael Creel. He's been a patron for a couple of years now. It translates to an awful lot of support. So I see you out here, Big Mike, and I appreciate you. Couldn't do it without you. If you're interested in supporting like MC, maybe check out the link in the description to the Patreon. If you're not interested, that's fine too. Let's go ahead and pull this train out of the station then. Let's look at the top 50 cards in Murders at Karlov Manor. Now 50 cards is a lot, but you know me, I still managed to have honorable mentions somehow. These are mostly just cards I want to get out of the way because I think they'd be kind of boring on the actual list. Stuff like the Surveil lands, these are really good. They might actually be in the top 10 cards in the set. Did you know they're fetchable? Of course you knew they're fetchable. It's all anybody can talk about. Surveil is probably better than Scry, and the Scry duels already see a little bit of play, especially in Commander. So I imagine these will go in some decks, but again, boring pick for the actual list. There's also Removal. Just removal, which can kind of be some of the best cards in a set sometimes, right? Like Black got an uncounterable Eliminate, just a strictly better Eliminate, which is really sweet. Not too shabby. We got like a Rakdos Bolt that also has like a Raise Dead effect stapled to it. That looks really, really good. White got a decent sweeper. Black got an unconditional sweeper at 5 mana. White got this thing that might be like the best Fiend Hunter of all time, and it's an elephant. Cool dude. So there's a lot of great removal in this set. But again, removal is just kind of like super boring to me to put on the actual list. I'm just going to park it all here so I don't have to worry about it on the list itself. Aside from that, there is at least one spot in the honorable mentions that I saved for a card that I think is actually kind of bad, but I really, really like. And this time around, it's Soulnovation. This is actually a sweet little card, and it kind of bleeds over from the removal a bit, if you'll pardon the pretty obvious pun. I liked it, but one way or the other, everyone's kind of talking about a different 4-mana enchantment that does stuff when creatures leave your graveyard, and we'll get to that one soon enough. It's not actually too far down my list. This one is probably just worse than that card, but it interests me far more. And that'll take you a long way when I'm the one writing the list, obviously. But a ping every time a creature leaves your graveyard can add up pretty fast. And in the meantime, you get a little removal spell that's not like super good, but you'll be happy that you had it when you have it, especially given the flash. So I really like this thing, and I can't help that about myself. Wanted to put a special spotlight on this, and now you can forget it exists. Hey, look at that. I think we actually set a new personal best for making it to the actual list this time around. So let's look at number 50, which is always kind of an extension of the honorable mentions in that it's a card that it's probably not good, but I really, really like. And this also kicks off a run of creatures in the first few cards on the list that I think are really expensive, but might have something to offer. So let's start with Persuasive Interrogators here at number 50. Now, even though I've been told explicitly in a song called Poison to never trust a big button to smile, that one line of text is doing it for me and just about everybody else. You know, whenever you pop a clue, your opponent gets a pair of poison counters. That basically means if you have, 4 clues out when this resolves and or Bartolome or anything else you can sack clues to, then suddenly just sack all your clues and you win the game, my friend. I know that it costs 6 mana to do that, but there is a caveat here. We don't think that 6 mana cards are unplayable in Standard. 6 mana cards are playable in Standard if they say you win the game on them, and this very well might. Number 49 is Rakdos, Patron of Chaos. This is basically a 6 mana 6/6 flample that's probably just going to draw you 2 cards at the end of the turn it comes into play. Now, your opponent might sacrifice stuff, but if they do, they have to sacrifice like non-token stuff. It's kind of amazing. So you're going to get 2 relevant permanents off the board if your opponent can't remove this before your end step, or you're just going to draw 2, which again is what I think is going to happen most of the time, but that's phenomenal. And it can catch you up from behind pretty well too. The problem is, again, it costs 6 mana. And as far as like 6 mana dudes go, this isn't the most desirable reanimation target in the format or anything. As far as Commander goes, maybe it has some shelf life there. But honestly, in most constructed formats, I think the 6 mana is going to be a bit too much. But again, you look at a card's text box sometimes and you just go, ooh, and this is one of those cards. Number 48 is Izoni. You know me. Sweet little card, but it's not actually a little card. It's a big old card. It costs 6 mana. This is the last 6 mana thing we'll look at for a while. I promise. That's why they're all up here on the list, is because it's actually really difficult to be like, this is the 6 mana thing that's going to see all the play. I don't know that it will, but again, sometimes you look at a card text box and you're like, hey, look at that. And it actually does stuff when it comes into play. That's a huge deal for me. You actually get some value out of this if your opponent does have a removal spell for it. I like that. But if it does stick around, it just gets you more stuff and more cards, and I love that about it. It's in some sort of Golgari mid-range deck, and one is currently extant in Standard. Don't know if it wants this. Again, it's a little expensive, but if it does want it, this creates a ton of value over the course of just a few turns for you. I've also just kind of always had a soft spot for Izonia in my heart, right? She's some sort of crazy elf spider lady, even though spider's not one of her creature types here, which kind of bugs me, but still, an elf spider. Make a lot of toys at the North Pole. Let's move on to the next card, which is Aurelia, the Law Above, here at number 47. See, we're going down like one mana value at a time, but in this case, I think we're actually taking a pretty big step up in terms of quality. This can actually come down in Standard, do some damage, man. The turn it comes into play, haste on in, and perhaps even draw you a card. And I guess if you're already in the position where you probably winning the game already because you're swinging with like a billion guys, it can give you even more value. But it's also worth noting that it triggers when your opponent attacks with that many creatures too. And that probably means it's really good in Commander because you have more opponents. But it can even be good in Standard where it can come down, immediately pounce on your opponent and give you some value. Let's move on to number 46, which is Ezram, Agency Chief. I've actually got written in my notebook Ezram Agency something because I couldn't remember, but it is Agency Chief, I believe. Now, talk about a 5-drop. While we're on 5-drops, this dude comes down and immediately gives you some value. And if you play him with enough mana untapped, he's basically just impervious to spot removal. It's a pretty good looking control finisher, but is it the kind of control finisher that blue-white control really wants right now? I'm not too sure, but a kind of mold drifter that can actually win the game by itself seems like a card I at least want to point out to you. So let's move on to number 45, which is Massacre Girl. Now, this is definitely the best looking big creature that we've seen on rate so far. However, I do think this card harbors a nasty secret in that it's normal. It's just a normal magic card, 4 mana, 4/4, couple of keyword abilities, spread some love around in terms of that second keyword ability, and yet can draw you some cards, but you really got to be fighting it out in the trenches in order to get the maximum number of cards off of this. This kind of strikes me as more of a sideboard card than a main deck card in Standard. Now, it is pretty easy to get caught up in the fact that we haven't seen Wither on a Standard legal card in like over a decade. That's awesome, and the card does look very fun, and at the end of the day, girls just want to have fun. What's so wrong with that? The card does look awesome, and I'm excited to play with it. Now, for number 44, let's switch gears a bit, and let's kind of switch brackets. We've been talking about really expensive creatures and all that for the first few entries on the list, but for the next like 15 cards here, let's talk about some stuff that needs to prove itself before I can call it good. These could be anywhere between bulk to busted, but we won't really know until we get our hands on them. And I think Chalk Outline is a great example of what I'm talking about here. Now, this is the 4-mana enchantment that I briefly teased during the honorable mention there. Now you get to see it in all of its glory. It costs 4 freaking mana, which is an awful lot, but in this case, whenever a creature leaves your graveyard, you get a 2/2 body and you get to investigate, which is tons of value. But is it enough value for 4 mana, or is this card just a really good use of a trope? I'm not really sure yet, but we will find out very, very soon. I've seen some people calling this card like amazing in Pioneer. Again, it's going to have to prove itself, much like number 43, Outrageous Robbery. Look, I know that most of the time you want to draw cards from your library because you chose to put those cards in your deck and they go with the other cards in your deck. Whatever. It's just super evil to take cards away from your opponent. And it's even more evil that the card basically just says exile the top X cards of their library. That's kind of bad enough. But the fact that you get to play them later, unbelievable. It's not going to be too hard to draw 4 or 5 cards off of this in some control decks and just basically end your opponent's game with their own cards. And again, evil is the operative word here. Of course, as Voltaire once said, no one loves you when you're evil, but it can be a whole lot of fun to be evil sometimes. So I'm looking forward to this one. But right after the Outrageous Robbery, we're going to reenact the crime here at number 42. This card could very well be a trap. As a matter of fact, that's probably the best way to describe this whole run of 15 cards from like 44 to 30 here is like these could be traps, or they could be the best cards we've seen in a really long time. And I think Reenact the Crime again is a great example of exactly that kind of card. This could either let you recast that spell that you just want to cast twice or didn't get to cast the first time or whatever, or you can counter one of your opponent's spells or just let it resolve. It doesn't really matter. And then just cast it. Hey, I like that spell you cast. Let me get one of those. So there's a lot you can do with this. And I think a lot of people are focused on the idea that you have to have like 6 mana open to use it because you have to counter their spell and then use it. And it just sits in your hand until you actually pull that play off. And these are all completely reasonable critiques, and I understand them. But again, part of my heart, I have a Magic player's heart, and part of that heart just can't resist the idea of making my opponent's biggest play of the game my biggest play of the game. 41 is Alquist Proft Master Sleuth, who's probably far better than I've indicated here. I have the feeling that this dude is actually kind of incredible. He could day one go into the Esper Legends deck in Standard, maybe make a little noise there. There's a ton of Esper decks that might want this dude. Plus, he's not the worst body for the mana cost. On rate, he's fine, and he also has a decent into the battlefield trigger that gives you some value in the form of a clue. And by the way, he also just casts Sphinx's Revelation. And even though you might be waiting until turn 5, 6, 7, or beyond even to actually fire off a Sphinx's Rev with this dude, in the meantime, he's actually a decently statted guy that got you value when he came into play. So I don't know why it was so difficult for me to figure out this card is great. I mean, how tough is it, Sherlock? The card's fine. My number 40 is Layline of the Guild Pact. Yeah, I felt like this was a great spot for this card, about halfway down the list of cards that have to prove themselves to me before I'll actually call them good. And yeah, I do think this card is a little bit overrated to me, but at the same time, I don't want to be wrong. The card does things. The other day when I was talking to my buddy Power Dragon here on the channel, I said, what does this card do? But what it actually does is fix all of your mana on turn 1, and there's some pretty sweet like combos with it. You could always do Case of the Shattered Pact on turn 2 after you've played a free one of these on turn 1, and then suddenly Case of the Shattered Pact just solves itself on turn 2. Now you still haven't played a threat. Hopefully your next one has haste so you can actually take advantage of Case, but still, we'll get there when we get there. There are cool combos with this, and even the first mode does stuff, I'm told. So a free thing is always going to be halfway decent. I do think that some people are just a little bit too geeked up on this card because it says Layline there and you get to play it for free. But I'll repeat myself, and I try not to do that too often these days, but free card. Free card is the important part of that phrase. Everyone likes a free card. My number 39 is Insidious Roots. I really want to play with this card. I mean, just the Cryptolith rights on the top half of it there, the thing that lets all your tokens tap for mana, might be good enough. What am I spending the mana on? I don't know, like more tokens? Just drawing cards or whatever, you know. Who cares? Well, who are you? You know, why are you asking questions? There's a lot to do with that first mode, but honestly, if it was just that first mode, I think we'd all be brewing around it, but it has more stuff, just gives you plants. Yet another thing that triggers whenever a thing comes out of your graveyard, but in this case, it's half as cheap to cast as the other stuff we've already covered with this ability. So that is super tempting, considering this too, just like, you know, Chalk Outline also puts bodies on the table. They start smaller than Chalk Outline, but they quickly get bigger. So of all the cards that do this in the set, like do a thing whenever a creature leaves your yard, this is the one I'm easily the most excited about. Speaking of 2-mana enchantments though, number 38 is Lost in the Maze. I actually kind of expect really big things from this card, but I'm reticent to put it like in my top 10 or anything like that. I don't think it's quite there, but there is a lot of versatility on this card, and I do think that there's decks it could fit into on day one. Bant Toxic has been doing really well in large-scale tournaments in Standard just recently, and this is a card that Bant Toxic could take very easily. It targets their guys, so you get Venerable Rob Priest triggers, and of course, it also makes it where your dudes have hexproof, which is the thing that deck really wants as well. And even if it doesn't go in that deck, it's commander playable forever, and I just like the idea that it's 2 mana. You don't even have to put anything into X if you don't want to. Things start getting very interesting when you do, but you can just plop this down for 2 mana at the end of your opponent's turn or whatever if they didn't give you a spell to counter, and suddenly for the rest of the game, all your tap dudes are going to have hexproof, which is a nice little extra thing to have. So again, I expect things out of this card, but I'm a little reluctant to actually say what I want to. You know, I'll put this card at like number 12. That's what I want to do, but I think I'm going to try to be smart instead. Wouldn't want to get lost in the sauce when it comes to Lost in the Maze. So let's move on to number 37, which is Undergrowth Recon. Yes, if you've seen the video with Dragon, which I will mention at least 1 or 2 other times in this video, you will know that I think this card is just slightly overrated, but that does not mean that I think that it's bad. Now, I have to say again, because this is the thing that bugs me the most about the card, and that's why it's all the way down here in the cards I'm not actually sure about, but still make the list section. You know, you play it on turn 3, you have to somehow facilitate it. You have to have lands in your yard, right? But you play it on turn 3, you get a land on turn 4, and you don't actually get to use that land till turn 5. That's such a slow Magic card, but you theoretically get lands almost every turn for the rest of the game. Again, if you can fuel the thing in the first place. That's good. In like a slow roll deck that plays a bunch of sweepers like Sunfall and Farewell or whatever, and you're keeping the board relatively clean, this can give you reliable ramp every single turn of the game. That's pretty good. In Commander, where you just kind of have more turns some of the time, again, a card like this is pretty good because it's going to actually translate into 3 mana for like 3 or 4 ramps, and that's a really, really good rate. But in a lot of standard decks, I'm not sure where this fits. That said, there are control-ish kind of ramp decks in standard that might actually be interested in a piece like this. My number 36 is Assemble the Players, another card that I kind of think it's overrated slightly, but that again doesn't mean I think it's a terrible Magic card. This will almost certainly see some Commander play where you have a little bit more sway over what's actually on top of your library, and if you don't like it, you can change it fairly easily with like fetch lands and tops and scries and blah, blah, blah. But even in standard, I think this definitely has a chance. Especially if you're playing flash creatures, this looks really good. And there's a bunch of decent 2 mana and less flash creatures right now. This can go really well in like the Errant and Giada deck. That's not bad. And of course, as a lot of people have pointed out to me, it can cast creatures that are over 2 mana value. All it really cares about is the power. So you've got plenty of like 4 drops that are 2 power, and this can cast off the top of your library. If more or less the entirety of your deck, aside from the copies you're running of this card, are 2 power dudes and just lands, you're still going to whiff like approximately 30 or more % of the time, depending on how many lands in your deck. Plus, you're also playing 4 copies of this card, so it'll whiff on itself if it's on top of your library. There's some things to talk about there. There's definitely some negatives to the card, but still, if it draws you, in air quotes, 2-3 cards over the course of the game, then it was definitely worth that 2 mana investment. Number 35 is yet another flash enchantment that I want to be like in my top 10, but I have to attempt to help myself sometimes. Let's look at Elicit Masquerade. I got some doubts about this thing too. Again, I'm trying to be rational. I want to be a grown-up Magic playing man some of the time, but still, I do think that there are some real game situations that are very common this card could be amazing in, and there's some really easy ways to set it up in standard right now, so you just can't count this thing out. The best way to use this is probably as kind of a counter spell to a removal spell or even a combat interaction of some kind. Just cash in your creature for something even bigger and better, hopefully much bigger and better, and I actually don't think it's that hard to pull off. Now, my number 34 is a testament to exactly how far Commander playability will take you on a list like this some of the time. Vaulting all the way up to number 34 ahead of everything we've seen so far is Judith, Carnage Connoisseur, who will see almost 0 play in standard, I assure you. Me and a bunch of other streamers will probably take it out for a test drive with cards like In the Festivities, all your spells gain Death Touch, One-Sided Wrath. How you like that? So it's going to be fun, but I'm not sure that that's actually going to be that amazing to do in competitive environments. That said, I've already received like 4 comments and 2 emails from different people about how jacked they are to play this card in Commander. It obviously looks extremely exciting there, and I wouldn't be surprised if this ended up being kind of an all-time Rakdos Commander. So it's got to be not super far up the list, but a good ways. So I felt like this was a good spot for her. Judy here also marks the beginning of a run on this list of legendary creatures that, again, kind of have to prove themselves to me before I can really endorse them. Things like Lazav, Wearer of Faces, which sure can be a Tyrannax Rex on like turn 3, but what else you got? What else you really doing, man? I mean, I guess a 2 mana 2/3 plus value is always going to be something that you want to look at. And the nut draws with it are just that, squirrely boy, but we are going to have to put some time in with this before we see if it's just a streamer special or if it's a real card in standard. Now, my number 32 is Teysa. You can tell I'm growing up because there's like 3 Orzhov legends in this set and none of them are in my top 10. And I love Teysa as a character, but again, you're going to have to put in some work for me, lady, is all I'm going to say, because I'm not too sure about this. I want it to be like a tireless tracker that makes creatures every turn, but it probably isn't going to be that. Sometimes, though, all it's going to have to be is a 3-mana 2/3 Death Touch, not the best stat line in the world, but at least it's got the Death Touch, that occasionally makes a 1/1 for you, that occasionally makes a clue for you. This is going in all of my Aristocrats Commander decks, because there it's very easy to make your opponents lose life every turn. You don't have to attack them or anything, and that works in Standard too, with cards like Vron and Elicit Core and a bunch of other stuff that I really, really enjoy playing with. So I'm excited about playing this Orzhov Legend in my favorite deck and all, but I still am a little bit, again, there's some reluctance here because I don't think this card is going to reliably trigger every single turn. And for it to be good, it probably should do that. We'll move on to 31, which is Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy. If you're a little inquisitive about why this card is all the way up here at number 31, I'll tell you why. I actually think this card is much better than most people are giving it any credit for. I don't think this would make anyone's like top 50 list. I've basically seen no one talk about it. I know the Growth Spiral half of it is sorcery speed, so everybody's just completely checked out after they see that, but a Growth Spiral at sorcery speed ain't actually half bad, especially considering you're making up for the instant speed, you see, by getting a 3/4 flying body that you can often play on turn 3, because you see, you cast Growth Spiral on turn 2. That's the secret to this card. But even if you don't cast it on turn 3, you just have like a 3/4 flyer sitting there for the rest of the game that you can cast whenever you get in trouble. That can make like more value for you too, by the way. That's good. All it had to be was a 3/4 flyer. But it's like, can I do more for you, kid? Like that? Yes, you can, Kellen. So I actually think they printed a halfway decent Kellen for once here. I like this guy kind of a lot. My only problem really is that we've seen Kel for like 3 sets in a row. When are we going to get to see Keenan? I don't know. I'm just mad about that. But we'll move on to number 30, which is Prof's Eidetic Memory. Now, this is the last of the cards that have to, quote, prove themselves to me, even though, who am I? I'm nobody, but still, to meet my exacting standards, we're going to have to get some time in with a lot of these cards that we've seen in these last like 15 entries, and I think this one takes the cake, whatever the heck that means, for that category. You know, this card could either be just absolutely incredible, smash people in the stupid mouths, or awful, just bad card. And I'm not sure that it's that. I'm actually leaning much more towards the one where you get to hit people in the mouth. It reminds me a little bit of a card like Up the Beanstalk. That card was pushed because it draws you a card when it comes into play, but still does this amazing thing later in the game. This draws a card when it comes into play. That's great, but it also, again, does this amazing thing later on into the game. You know, turn 4, 5, 6, where you actually start attacking with stuff and you have the mana to draw cards. Suddenly your guys are getting huge, way faster than your opponent anticipated your blue guys getting. So I actually think that, just if we're talking Commander, this probably sees play for the rest of time, but it does have a shot in competitive environments. But we are in the 20s, everybody. We made it here pretty quick, actually, and we are going to go on like a 5-card run of cards that I think are just good. They're not going to win the game by themselves or anything, but they're probably going to show up in more than one deck, whether they're sideboard, main deckable, just role players, who knows. These are not going to be incredibly powerful cards, but cards like Doorkeeper Thrall are still going to be integral parts of your deck some of the time. It's kind of a Hushbringer without the lifelink, doesn't care about death triggers, but does care about artifact ETBs. So, you know, it's not necessarily a Hushbringer, but it's definitely a thing that reminds you of Stern Strict Proctor. They printed a few cards like this in just the last few years, but this is one of the best, especially if you are talking about Commander. But even in Standard, there are going to be a bunch of effects that trigger when an artifact ETBs, and I can see a bunch of decks trying to take advantage of exactly those kinds of ETB triggers in the very near future. So it's going to be nice to have a tool like this, but it's just nice for all formats to have a tool like this, if I'm being honest. Also, it's just always good to see a Thrall, but we'll move on to number 28, which is Wojek Investigator. This honestly almost belongs in the category of cards that have to prove themselves to me, but it's just kind of undeniably good, you know? If your opponent is ever kind of out-carding you, then you're going to be able to catch up a little bit with this. I wish it just, you know, drew you the card, but instead it just gives you an investigate token, which is fine. Sometimes you're going to want the clue for other value that it might bring you apart from drawing you a card. Sometimes a clue is better than drawing a card, depending on what you're doing. But what I mostly like about this is that even if you never really get any real value off of it, 3-mana 2/4 flyer. It's got flying and vigilance, I believe. So that's like 2 keyword abilities and 2/4 for just 3 mana. That's actually a halfway decent stat line just in and of itself. So you're not really failing if you just cast this card and don't get value off of it. It's also an angel. That might matter for like the Giada and the other angel builds and stuff. There's just a lot of places this card could go. Even in Commander. Again, I got to bring that format up because we we're evaluating it for Commander too. You know, all the formats matter, right? In a video like this. So I think this could provide you a good amount of, you know, value over the course of a few turns in Commander, and that matters too. But there might be some standard playability on this where it can't be, you know, lightning struck. It can't be cut down. And in other formats, it can't be bolted. And these are the things that matter. But speaking of clues, number 27 is Sharp-Eyed Rookie. This also gives you a bunch of clues. It kind of has evolve a little bit, but whenever it evolves, it also gives you a clue token, which is busted. Again, I want to kind of call this a tireless tracker. It feels a bit like a tireless tracker, you know, just a dude that gets bigger throughout the course of the game and also provides you them sweet clue tokens. You know, if time has taught us anything, it's that clue tokens are better than we think they are, almost no matter how good we think they are. So a green 2-drop that not only gets to be, you know, a 4/4 relatively easy over the course of the game, but also gave you 2 clues in that very situation, actually seems like a sweet card. I don't know if it's in the same league as a thing like Kyrion Beastcaller or the other cards like Kyrion Beastcaller, Galagreeters, and Standard right now, or if it's actually leagues beyond those cards. But again, I'm actually leaning towards the latter there. I think this is a fantastic card. But speaking of clues, you see what I'm doing with this run of cards here? We're going to talk about yet another 2-drop that puts clues into play. It's Homicide Investigator. Now, this one I'm really excited about again, kind of in these Commander decks, you know, you got a bunch of creatures dying, you might as well get a clue every turn. Is it enough value because you're only getting 1 clue per turn off this guy? I think that it very easily could be even in a format like Commander where you're trying to just go crazy with the value as much as you can. But when we, you know, when we narrow it down to Standard a little bit, zoom in, I was going to say zoom out. You zoom in and you look at a format like Standard, and suddenly, again, the card does look very tempting, especially when we go back to that Bart deck we talked about towards the top of the video with Persuasive Interrogators in the 6-drop slot. You play it, you'll win the game as soon as you resolve it. A card like Homicide Investigator could go a long way towards making that board state actually happen. But even if you're not playing to some kind of like weirdo combo win or whatever, this will just give you a fair amount of value over the course of the game if it stays in play. If it makes 2 clues, it did a lot. But we have reached the halfway point of the list, everybody. And number 25 is Novice Inspector. I felt like this was a great place to park this card for multiple reasons. First of all, 25 is kind of a good baseline for the list. You know what I mean? Like everything below this is probably worse than it. Everything above this is probably better, but we know that Thraben Inspector is a really, really good card. And I felt again, like it'd be a great sort of baseline of power level for this list. This I think is probably just better than the last couple of cards we discussed that give you clues. This is a 1-drop that is half the price of the last 2 cards we've discussed, and it's 1/3 the price of a card like Teysa. And instead of having to jump through hoops like having a creature die or, you know, playing a creature bigger than it just comes into play and gives you a clue. So we're talking about a half price discount on these last couple of cards, and it's guaranteed to pay you the 1 clue. Like, yeah, I think that's just better. Again, we've already experienced a whole 2 years of Standard where we knew this card was incredible, and it's incredible in Pioneer to this day. So yeah, I think it deserves the number 25 spot. But starting with number 24 and going through number 20 here, let's look at some more Commander stuff before we get to the best cards in the entire set. But you could argue these are still the best cards in the set, like Krinko, Baron of 10 Street. Really interesting card here. It's a 3-mana 3/3 haste, so it can actually attack like somewhat profitably, but notably it can also use its ability the turn it comes into play, which is really, really sweet. Putting extra goblins out is always great, and honestly just having an outlet to sack artifacts too is going to be good. With a lot of the artifacts, not just in the set, but that we already have in Standard. Speaking of a card that'll be welcome in Commander, though, number 23 is Case of the Locked Hothouse. This is a sweet card just looking at the solve state. You don't look at really anything else on the card besides the solve state, and just read that, and you'll be like, oh, yeah. Yeah, that's nuts. If anything, this might see play in green Commander decks for ever. So I have to at least bring it up. 22 is World Souls Rage. I cannot tell you how much I want this card to be playable in Standard, man. I really, really do. It's basically an X spell that also has ramp on it. Like, what do you want? You do have to kind of facilitate the ramp just a little bit, but it shouldn't be that hard. I don't know, man. I think this card is actually quite playable in Standard, especially given the scalability. When the ramp deck does draw it on like turn 8 or whatever, and they can just fry your face for like 7 damage and then also get a bunch of lands. Like, yeah, they're going to really, really like that. So again, the scalability looks key on this to me. I am a huge fan of X spells, especially X spells that just say do X damage to a thing, because I'm a big stupid oaf. You know, I like, oh, X damage to a thing. Oh, caveman. I like that. But when they come stapled to ramp, I think you've actually got a really potent magic card on your hands. But for number 21, let's look at my commander card to end all commander cards in this set, at least again from my perspective, because I cannot wait to give myself a copy of Vin Ripper Baby like this again. I have already said this a couple times at least in this video, but elicit core, Judith. When it comes out, the Fallout set comes out, Kaiser, that guy. He's going to be a great Aristocrats commander, and Mardu, can't wait to get that card either, but it's going to be a little while. Either way, this card directly into every single one of those decks, and basically every Aristocrats commander deck from now until long past we've all triggered Blood Artist ourselves in our real lives. But don't look now, everybody. We have made it to the top 20 together, the absolute best 20 cards in the set. How are we going to kick it off? With some uncommons. Of course, that's Magic in 2024, man. Some of these uncommons are righteous, and in this set particularly, we got to see some great stuff, like Aftermath Analyst here. I always have to go really slow to not say analyst, which I guess I already have here. Please don't demonetize me. But yeah, 5th time I've taken this card because I didn't want to say it the other way. But yeah, 2 mana for a thing that mills 3 cards, has a halfway decent toughness, and also just casts Splendid Reclamation. This card's an uncommon, man. Like, why is this card an uncommon? I don't understand. It goes in like 3 decks that I want to build on day 1, whether those decks are Stick Fingers or Insidious Roots or whatever. There's a bunch of stuff that wants to mill, but the fact that this is a little 2 mana nerd guy with a cool ETB that really cheap to cast, obviously, and then does something incredibly righteous in the late game. Yeah, man. Absolutely, I want to play this card. This could have been a rare, and I probably would have been fine with that. I would have understood it. But number 19 is a card draw piece that I just really don't see anybody talking about, and I don't get it. I demand answers as to why no one's talking about demand answers. This card's awesome, man. It's, first of all, it's not just Tormenting Voice. It's so much better. It can just be like an instant speed Tormenting Voice, which is already good enough. But the fact that this just lets you sacrifice whatever artifacts you got laying around is just unbelievable, especially in a world where we have Experimental Synthesizer in standard. It's phenomenal. Am I nuts? That seems like a really good little combination there, but there's obviously plenty of other little artifacts that you might have laying around that you don't mind putting in your yard. Aside from that, probably the better thing to do, tokens. There's so many. We got blood tokens, we got clue tokens, we got map tokens. I'm missing like 2 treasure tokens. There's so many tokens in standard right now. There's really no shortage of things to sacrifice to this and get your 2 cards for 2 mana at insto speed. Like, this is a phenomenal Magic card. And again, I almost put it on the sleepers list because I don't see anybody talking about it. But this is one of those cards I was just like, no, it's just too good to put on the sleepers list. So if you're not paying attention to this, if it's just somehow gotten lost in the shuffle, this card exists and is probably very easily one of the best cards in the set. But number 18 is Crime Novelist. Maybe, just maybe, smoke settles and the dust clears. One of the best uncommons I've ever seen. Sacrificing an artifact is a very real condition. You know, you can't just go doing that willy-nilly. There's not a bunch of cards that just let you do that. Actually, there are. There's a ton of cards. We've already talked about Gleeful Demolition in this video. We've already talked about Bartolome. He just lets you sacrifice cards too. There's a bunch of other stuff too, like Oni Cold Anvil, for instance. This could go in. And then suddenly, not only is he getting bigger every turn, which is a very real thing, you know, extremely real, but you're also getting the mana. I think the mana is the important part about this. Not only is there all the synergies I've already mentioned, but let's bring up treasure tokens again. This is basically kind of like a gold span dragon. Like, whenever you pop a treasure token, just get an extra red mana. If Dockside Extortionist needed a best friend, I guess he has him in Commander now, but obviously there's plenty of stuff this could do in Standard too, you know, the turn before you play a big score. This card looks pretty good because it basically makes big score mana neutral on the next turn. What else do you want out of a Magic card? Like, kind of a stupid card to actually have exist, and I know that 3 mana is a little bit much in terms of the entry fee to get in on this card on the ground floor, but the ceiling is so incredibly high on it, you know? Not, again, getting bigger is fine. It's that mana that's the key. But you know, really, I am still a Timmy at heart, and I have to admit it. So sometimes on my list, all you have to do to beat 2 mana card draw and ridiculous mana generation is just be a big dumb guy that I like. So Tristani, 3 Whispers is number 17 here, a 3 mana 4/4. Sign me up for that. I'm a sucker for that stat line period already. But when you also throw 3 ridiculous and somewhat cheap, honestly, keyword abilities onto it, then you've really got my attention all of a sudden. Vigilance is actually better than anyone thinks it is, and just 1 mana for that is halfway decent. But obviously, the Death Touch and the Double Strike, especially when combined, that's the real attraction. But speaking of 4/4s, let's talk about Krenko's Buzz Crusher. I just really like that term, Buzz Crusher. That's great. A great word you've invented there, Wizards, but the card is also pretty good. You designed a good Magic card as well, and even though I'm not sure it's quite as good, I think this would be like number 3 on a lot of people's lists based on some of the talk that I've seen. It's not quite there for me, but it's still a final boss of a Magic card. I mean, it's just going to come down and have this incredible effect on the game immediately. It's not an Avalanche Riders. I think it's meant to evoke Avalanche Riders to old school Magic players, but I think Avalanche Riders is probably just a better card. I know it's not a 4/4 flample or anything, but I do think it's the better card. This is still going to let your opponent go get a land or whatever, but it's going to take that tri-land away. It's going to take that important creature land away. And a lot of times you'll be very happy, especially considering that Field of Ruin came stapled to a thing they really got to do something about, and they can't just go for the throat at either because it's an artifact. So I do think this is going to have some fun times in Standard, and obviously in Pioneer, where because of the way it's worded, it just blows up Lotus Fields for some reason. The designers just decided that it doesn't say the word target, so you're just not targeting the thing that you're targeting it. You're targeting the thing. It just doesn't use the word target, and the designers are like, haha, it doesn't use the word, so you can blow up anything you want with this. I honestly don't know how I feel about that from a design perspective, but I gotta admit the card is powerful. Number 15 is Kaya, Spirit's Justice. Now, like I said, there's like 3 Orzhov Legends in this set, and they're all on my list somewhere. That said, I feel like I've done a good job being a big boy and not just putting them all in my top 10. Kaya, though, just barely outside of it. And if you're doing the math, you'll know that there's another one coming up. So, and they're somehow all not in my top 10, so it's going to be really soon. But for now, we're talking about Kaya, a 4 mana kind of zombify effect, so long as you have clues or other tokens about, then suddenly this can grab something out of your yard, and for at least 1 turn, you get a big thing. That's it. You don't get any like enter the battlefield trigger or anything like that because the clue was already out, presumably, or whatever token you're using. So yeah, that kind of sucks. There's some hoops you have to jump through to actually, use the right reanimator targets with a card like Kaya. So there's some interesting choices you have to make in deck building, but honestly, that's a plus in my opinion. But aside from that, there's all these other abilities on the card, right? She removes things, she gives you bodies, and she does other stuff. She has this ridiculous passive we've already talked about. So like really for 4 mana, that's a pretty decent investment for a Planeswalker that does this much stuff. So I actually think 15 is about right for her. She's probably going to make some waves in Standard at the very least. Number 14 is Breakout. This is just a couple of Gruul mana, just red and a green to put a body on the table. It has to be a relatively small body, but like I kind of don't care. I would have much rather this be instant speed, but even at sorcery speed, I can't really complain too much. I think there's going to be plenty of combo decks that want to play a card like this because, you got a 2-card combo with 2 small guys, like a devoted druid thing maybe going on. Who knows what you're doing, but one way or the other, you've got a 2 or 3 card combo you absolutely have to assemble as quickly as possible. This is a 6-card dig that just puts that important 2-drop onto the table for you. And I think that's going to matter a lot, especially in formats that aren't Standard or Commander, like in formats like Pioneer and Modern that have options. They have access to like way deeper combos and way better 2-drops and such. They can just slap into play with this. Yeah, I think this will actually see some play kind of the farther back you go in terms of formats. And those tend to be very powerful cards. Breakout's no different. This is a good one. But all the way up here at number 13, we have yet another card that I've kind of called overrated just in the last few days, but I cannot deny that Connecting the Dots is a very good Magic card. And it's on my list above all the other red card draw in this set. There's a little goblin with Disguise that you can flip over for like 6 mana, but he costs 1 less to cast or 1 less to flip for each instant and sorcery in your yard. Draws you like 3 cards. That dude looks okay. It looks all right. There's like Expedited Inheritance, which is a 2-mana card draw enchantment that's symmetrical, and the symmetry looks kind of difficult to break in red. Those are halfway decent looking cards that I still kind of think are overrated. This, on the other hand, I can think is overrated. You see, it's possible to hold 2 opinions. I can think it's overrated and still think it's a really good Magic card at the same time. And in this case, I definitely do. The fact that all this really needs is for creatures to attack, Doesn't need him to do combat damage or anything like that. Just attack with creatures. And suddenly you're storing cards under this. And you're going to feel pretty bad, yeah, when your opponent disenchants it or otherwise breaks it. But in case they don't do that and their whole plan is to like cast farewell, well, then suddenly, so long as you got a turn or two of attacking him with the connecting the dots on the table, you can just kind of just draw like 5 cards, you know, and that is going to be really good in the face of not just sweepers, but all kinds of spot removal and 1-for-1 shenanigans your opponent might be trying against you. So yeah, I think this is going to be worth bringing in from the board at the very least in a lot of aggro decks, but there's going to be mid-range decks and like the Boros Tokens deck and other decks that play like Wedding Announcement and Wandering Emperor, and they actually do attack, you know, with like small fries every now and again. I think they're going to really, really like a card like this. And number 12 is Analyze the Pollen. Yeah, all the way up here at 12. These cards always tend to be stronger than they look. We've already been through this with Traverse the Ulvenwald and a couple of other cards like this. Just the ability to go grab a basic land basically means that in some decks you can just cut 4 basic lands and play this instead. So there's like more or less 0 opportunity cost to playing a card like this, which is a huge, enormous deal. And then later on in the game, just go in and get whatever dude you want. It just becomes like a tutor for whatever guy, a single mana. That is a busted Magic card. And in a lot of cases, especially once you do get to turn 5, 6, 7, whatever, later in the game in your mid-range or control deck, it's not going to be very hard to collect that evidence whatsoever. Again, if there's anything we've learned from cards like Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise and the whole, you know, Delve saga when we first saw it, it is not as hard as you think to get a bunch of cards in your yard. And for a card like this, you don't even need a bunch of cards in your yard. You just need expensive cards in your yard to actually pop it off for the full value. And that also is not going to be as hard as it seems. But let's look at number 11, kind of an honorable mention for the top 10. And this is where we park our final Orzhov legend of the video, everybody. I hate to say it, none of them actually made the top 10 this time around, and you know that breaks my heart, but I still got to bring up Tomik. Wielder of Law? Is that actually your name? I just love you, but I don't know your name. Wielder of Law was in fact your name. This, just like Wojak Investigator, I got to bring that card up again, is a 3-mana, 2/4 Flying Vigilance, which is just an incredible stat line for the actual rate that you're putting into it. The mana you invested, that's really, really good. Again, doesn't die to Lightning Bolt, doesn't Lightning Strike, doesn't die to Cut Down. These are very, very important sort of metrics in Standard right now. Plus, this, you know what I always say about Sheoldred? If you've been following the channel for a while, you've probably heard me say this about Sheoldred the Apocalypse like 6 times. The worst thing about that card, and really the best thing if you're playing with it, is that it punishes your opponent for playing Magic. They got to play Magic. They got to draw cards, you know? Not every opponent has to attack you, but it's a similar vibe, right? You're punishing your opponent for playing Magic. And even though I don't usually love cards that are heavily dependent on what your opponent is doing, in this case, it's just them attacking. It's just them attacking you with 2 guys, which is a fairly common occurrence in like most games of Magic. So this is going to punish them heavily for just trying to get in on you at all. You know, a couple of guys and suddenly they take a bolt's worth of damage and you draw a card, and you got a 2/4 Flying Vigilance to block with too, presumably. I do for real objectively think this is one of the stronger cards in the set. Not only for Standard, but obviously for Commander and even beyond. Again, we got an Esper Legends deck, we got a Joda deck, blah, blah, blah. I'm done talking about it, although I could talk about it all day, but I got to talk about the next card all day because we are in the top 10 officially. My favorite 10 cards in the set, sort of, but also what I objectively think are the best cards in the set. And that is where we come to a crossroads, because my number 10 is a card that I am certain is one of my favorite cards. And I am attempting to be as objective about it as possible. But that's very hard when push-pull looks this good. I think this wouldn't be even on a lot of people's top 50s. And it is markedly, noticeably, the only split card on this list. And there's some like Cease and Desist that I think are very, very good cards. But this, absolutely broken looking to me. And I don't know if broken's the right word to use, but it is a serviceable removal spell you're going to be happy that you have. But in case you can't get any value out of that mode on it, there's also a mode on it that just wins you the game. This the 6 mana. Remember earlier when I said cards in Standard can cost 6 mana, so long as they are, you win the game. So long as they have that line of text on, you win the game, you can play a 6 mana card in Standard. This almost certainly has that mode, but also has a mode where you just clean up the board state. That's crazy to me. This is easily one of the better looking cards in the set, even if no one else is talking about it, ain't on nobody else's list. I am not going to temper my own thoughts here and put this card at like number 40 something and be like, I think it's pretty good. I just want to bring your attention to it. No, this card is definitely in my top 10, and not just because it's one of my favorite cards in the set, because I objectively think this card has a lot of work to do. But my number 9 is Steam Core Scholar, despite being that super annoying friend that's still into steampunk in 2024. I mean, I get cosplay's fun, but it's steampunk. It was 2011. Anyway, I still think this card is really, really sweet, despite all the bits and shtick that I just poured into it. Drawing 2, discarding 2 when it comes into play on like a Windrakey flyer, they also just slap Vigilance on. Apparently, design team just hates Wandering Emperor, so they throw Vigilance onto everything, but it's a decent ability still. Strictly Better Windrake that also draws you 2 cards and discards 2 when it comes into play is good enough. It's not Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but it's still going to set up an awful lot of Reanimator strategies, and again, beyond just that, flashback, disturb, all kinds of stuff can come out of the graveyard in this set. Collect evidence, right, is a thing. So this will set up all kinds of stuff, and that's if you discard the 2 cards. This could just like be neutral in terms of card advantage if you wanted to. If you discard the right thing, you only have to discard one thing. So again, let me repeat myself. 2 mana, 2/2 flying Vigilance, double keywords, and draws you a couple of cards when it comes into play. That's a that's a I shouldn't even have to tell you like, well, it's been pretty good in Reanimator. Here's a deck you can play it in. It's just obviously on its face a very, very good Magic card. But number 8, holy moly, it's Anzrag the Quake Mole. I finally did it. Everyone in the comments of the preview video is like, why didn't you say holy moly or holy guacamole or something like that? It's because I had to save. I can't just use all the jokes. I sometimes have to save jokes for the top 50. But yeah, Anzrag, he's not my number 1. I've seen him be like multiple people's number 1s already on YouTube this week. Not quite. He is, in essence, just a big guy. He's just a big, stupid guy. And like, again, caveman, I like those things, but I can't necessarily give like the top 3 slot to just like a big mole man, despite how adorable and terrifying he might be. Doesn't have any downside though. A 4 mana dude with 8 power that you can actually like attack with and block with and stuff. He's not like weird about it like Ancient One or anything. Oh, I'm big, but I'm just sitting here. I don't want to be involved. No, this guy is actually like really jacked to get involved. He wants everyone to block him. He wants to rumble with everybody on the table if you got enough mana. But honestly, I'm not even that interested in the activated ability. All I'm interested in is a 4 mana 8/4 that occasionally rolls back your attack step. Like, even if it only does it once, it's probably good enough. My number 7 is Intrude on the Mind. Yeah, I think this card is that good, man. This is probably one of the more controversial cards of the season. Do you love it? Do you hate it? There's basically no in between. I am one of the people that absolutely loves it. I don't think that 5 mana, especially at instant speed, is anywhere near too much to ask for the majority of control decks in Standard. They have access to some other stuff that they might rather play, but honestly, looking at my options, I would rather play this than Silver Scrutiny, and as far as Memory Deluge, it's kind of a toss-up. Might have to wait on rotation, but it's going to be good at some point in its Standard life cycle, I can almost bet you. Not only is this kind of a fact or fiction, but it's also kind of a 3/3 flyer a lot of the time. It draws you 3 cards and it's a 2/2 flyer, or it draws you 2 cards, it's a 3/3 flyer. Either way, that's a really kind of great rate considering you can cast it on your opponent's attack step and kind of ambush something and block it, or maybe just cast it on your opponent's end step and end up with potentially a 5/5 flyer. It's going to smash face in for the rest of the game. Hey, you don't want to give me a 5/5 flyer? Cool, give me 5 cards. Either way, I'm pretty sure you lose the game, dog. So, like, a really ridiculous card situationally, but honestly, it's not too hard to enter that situation for a control deck. Now, number 6 is No More Lies. I still think Linkin Park every time I read this card. No more lines, but either way, at one point, this card was number 1 on my list. Through 2 rewrites, this card was number 1 on my list, but I just couldn't in good conscience give it to a counter spell. Not because I hate counter spells, but because it's a glorified removal spell at the end of the day. It's like, it doesn't win the game by itself. It doesn't have any big splashy effects. It's not going to go in every deck forever, but it is going to go in quite a few of them, in quite a few formats. This is easily one of the best cards in the set, and I would be fooling myself if it weren't in my top 10. Basically, you see Mana Leak and you got to pour one out, pun intended, but is it going to be like in my top 3? Now, it's a counterspell. Is it the best counterspell in Standard? Probably. But let's move on to number 5, everybody. We're actually getting there. Number 5 is Case of the Uneaten Feast. So it's a Johnny's Welcome, plus value, which is already like that's in my top 10 just period. I don't even care what the other value is. Like if you're just a Johnny's Welcome, you're in my top 10. I love that card, you know, so maybe it's just because it's me we're talking about, but you also get a lot of points from me when your solve case, your solve state down here is a Yawgmoth's Will for creatures. So you can only hit creatures with it, but that's still a really, really sick mode, dude. And it's not hard at all to gain the 5 life needed to solve this, especially given that you have a freaking Johnny's Welcome. If you have multiple out at the same time, they're going to solve themselves very, very fast just when you play like a couple of creatures in the same turn. But number 4, let's stay on the case with Case of the Stashed Skeleton. Yeah, I really do think this is like in the best cards in the set. This is another one that's like kind of controversial. Some people love it. Some people hate it. Some people think it's terrible. Some people think it's the best card in the set. And again, I'm with the second group of people. I'm kind of with the latter group here. I think this card is absolutely bonkers. It is not too hard to sacrifice the skeleton. And honestly, I've seen a lot of people be like, what do you just try to get in with the skeleton until they're forced to block it? Yeah, that's exactly what you do. 100% what you do. And then the turn that they block the skeleton because they don't want to, you know, lose too much life to it. You just start having access to Demonic Tutor. It's unbelievable. A 2-mana 2/1 menace that can't block, and when it dies, all hell breaks loose, and you get to tutor for whatever you want. And sure, it costs a couple of mana. I don't care. All I have to do is lose the skeletons, just no skeletons, and suddenly I just Demonic Tutor. Come on, man. Like, it's a Demonic Tutor that puts a body on the table. And like, if you don't think that's a good Magic card, I kind of don't know what you want. But we have made it to the top 3 strongest cards in the entire set, ladies and gentlemen. Let's start with maybe the hardest card to cast in the whole set, but you know, doesn't mean it's actually hard to cast. Let's look at Archdruid's Charm here. I mean, I guess if we can cast Invoke Despair in 3-color decks, then we can probably cast this in 3-color decks in Standard, but obviously it goes way beyond Standard. It played Commander. You can play this bad boy in Modern and Pioneer and maybe even Legacy and Vintage. This card is absolutely bonkers, and look at all the stuff it does. Instant speed ramp, which I don't think enough people are really taking into account, but aside from the instant speed ramp, you can also instant speed creature tutor, which is blown out. Also, I just really losing my mind talking about this card in the first place, but it's also a bite effect that puts a counter on a guy. It does more than that. This card does everything. As a matter of fact, I think green is potentially back on the menu in Standard for what feels like the first time in forever. And you know what? Actually, hold on just a second. There. All right. The green mana symbol is back on the wall. You guys have been asking for it back on the wall for a while now. I will not explain why it was off the wall. I won't. It's the most innocuous possible explanation, and it would take too much time. But either way, green is back in Standard, everybody, and it was already kind of making a comeback with the Golgari deck, the domain decks, and all that. But with cards like this and a few other cards in the set, I think that Wizards is trying to actually bring green back into real Standard playability for the first time in a while. I'm excited about that. But my number 2 is a card that I'm about to explode over, honestly. It's War Leader's Call. This card exists. This card, it's not many cards that can get me excited to play Boros. And it's not that I hate Boros, it's that they just attack. They mostly just attack, you know. And I like to do other stuff. I like to attack, don't get me wrong, but I like to do other stuff a lot of the time. And this card has got me excited to play Boros for the first time in a while in a bunch of different, you know, formats and forms, you know, not only in Standard. Can this be a great card in the Boros Convoke deck that, again, you could play Gleeful Demolition in. Imodane Recruiter, you know, it's got the ability to put like a couple of dudes into play on its adventure half. So that's kind of nice. There's a ton of cards in Standard that put a bunch of dudes in play at the same time, or over the course of a number of turns. When you start looking at Commander, the card starts looking really, really good. Even when you start looking at Cube, let me go back to that format. I am always having a really hard time finding Boros cards that I actually want to put in my cube or that I find interesting or fun to play. And now I don't have that problem, at least with one of those slots. This is getting ordered the moment that I have a chance to order the card. I'm super excited about this, and it really took me a lot of discipline not to make this my number 1 card. But eventually we got to talk about number 1. Eventually we have to do that, because if I'm that excited about War Leader's Call, what could I possibly think is the number 1 card in the set? Well, there is one card that's a little bit conspicuous in its absence, and it's Delny Streetwise Lookout. Now, this is 3 mana, and some people think that makes it riffraff, a street rat, but I don't buy that. I think this is easily the best card in the set. In Standard, there's already been a lot of talk of this being in the Bant Toxic deck as well. Now, it does cost 3 mana. I don't think that deck wants to spend 3 mana on its turn 3 playing a card like this, but that's just me. It could very easily go in that deck because then it triggers Venerable Rot Priest twice, and that seems really fun. Yada yada. But this goes in a bunch of other standard decks with a bunch of other like serviceable 2-power dudes that do a lot of cool stuff when they enter the battlefield. But obviously, any Panharmonicon effect is going to be really, really fun in Commander. It's going to be a great card in Brawl, Standard Brawl, Historic Brawl, all the Brawls, plus Commander, any singleton format. A lot of people are really excited to build with this card, and honestly, I'm not the only one that's already started to build with this card in singleton formats. You know, it sucks that in Commander, it's basically just a mono white card, but there's still plenty of fun tricks you can do with it. In constructed environments, yeah, I understand the 3 mana is a bit much to get started, but the fact that this basically makes a bunch of your dudes semi-unblockable, you know, and also Panharmonicons their triggers, yeah, you're going to find plenty of stuff to do with that. I'm really excited about this in just about every format you could possibly play the card in. Might be dressed like Aladdin, but I got a feeling at the end of the day, you will never have a friend like D. Just a sweet little card, and it is my number 1 card in MKM. But that is it. We are wrapped up for this one, baby. So let me know if I missed any cards down there. I probably did. You know, I didn't put Hunted Bone Brood or Axebane Ferox on this list, and there's probably a couple of other cards you could bring up for contention in this thing. So I could understand if you're a little upset with me for missing your favorite card or whatever. If you did miss your favorite card, make sure you check out the Sleepers list that we did a few days ago. Link in the description to that, and to the Power Dragon video, and to the Patreon, and to the Twitch, and to other videos. All kinds of stuff down there in the description. Check it out. Before you do that, make sure you let me know how you felt about this one down there in the comments. Aside from that, you can always again do the YouTube stuff. If you already did it, don't do it again. That'll undo it. So if you've already hit the like button, don't hit it again. That'll unlike the video. You know what I'm trying to say. Either way, subscribe if you want to. We're only about 400 subs away from 132,000 subs, and I'd really like to get there. Help us out. Aside from that, again, you can check out the Patreon if you want to be like Michael Creel, Big Mikey Creel over here, patron of the day. You can always check that out. If you don't want to, that's fine. I'm just glad that you're still here watching the video all the way to the outro. I love you very much, and that is Allski Kowalski. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.